There's all kinds of landscape, and you need to sort it all, gather it into bundles, and present yourself with another branching choice. If my park is about the intrinsic value of nature, and I have to choose between kind of formal, linear, organized, grid-like landscape elements, or curvilinear, natural, irregular landscape elements, which am I going to choose? Irregular. Because formal, straight, linear, not nature. So you choose. And what that leads us to, what it led us to, was a kind of a statement that we could say, look, when we begin a design, our design is going to be like this. The intrinsic value of nature means that, nature's going to dominate the whole design. It's going to be about natural forms. We're going to let natural things take place. We're going to deliberately make the architecture subordinate to the natural forms. The architecture has to either appear to be celebrating nature itself, or it has to appear to be succumbing to nature itself. That way, it will be obvious in the very design of the park, when we begin to design, that this is a park about the intrinsic value of nature. And so we did this several times. We took different design elements. We did, in fact, revisit the architecture itself and figure, okay, we know we have to have architecture. We just know that we don't want to have the architecture be dominant. So how does this theme express itself in architecture? And we did this with several themes. The intrinsic value of nature, this sort of transforming power of physical adventure, that if you go out and dare yourself to do things, you will come back changed. This sort of theme of the universal love of animals, that one way or another, whether it's a live animal, an imaginary animal, a prehistoric animal, a storybook animal, one way or another, there's a form of the animal world that brings people emotionally alive and that we can use to bring them into contact with this idea. And that all happens before we start thinking, okay, maybe we could have a ride that did this, and maybe we could do that, and there could be a big tree, or maybe there's a river, maybe there's an island, maybe there's a giant broccoli, whatever. And that goes down on cars. Now this is kind of cool. I don't know why we did this, but as we were developing Animal Kingdom, we never threw these cards away. We stuck them in boxes. So these are the real cards. We really did pin to the board almost 20 years ago, when we were beginning to talk about design of Disney's Animal Kingdom. These words that are written on these cards, most of that is my handwriting, which I'm not necessarily proud of, and the other handwriting I recognize is from Kevin Brown, who's moved on to other things. He was one of our chief writers, and we just started riffing on this idea and branching it out, sort of diagramming it. So again, there's no design going on. We're sort of diagramming out the story, and okay, if those are the values and these are the opportunities, how does this diagram itself out into a story that people can interact with? And these, again, are from 3x5 cards and 5x7 cards that are almost 20 years old, that we drew these little diagrams on as we tried to, take our brains through how are we going to organize this, and then when we get to the sub-pieces, how are we going to organize them? Now, you may notice that these don't necessarily look like the way the park actually turned out, is because there were many, many of these cards. Anything that we work on, it doesn't go in a straight line. It can't go in a straight line, because you really don't know the conclusion. You only know the goal. So every day presents you with these branching choices in design, and you're constantly steering and branching as you find your way towards which of the potential goals will actually be the goal we can reach when we get to the outer end of this process. In a way, it resembles a tree where you start out at the root. You start out where the tree touches the ground, and you know you're going to end up on one leaf of this tree by the time you're done, but you do not know which leaf. So you just start traveling up this tree of ideas, and constantly you're meeting opportunities, challenges, changes, and you find your way out. So these diagrams sometimes don't look like what ended up getting built, but they represent the way we thought about how to build it, so that by the time it was done, we would be confident that there would be strong anchored ideas beneath what otherwise are kind of weirdly disparate elements. I mean, there's nothing that necessarily pulls these things together emotionally so that they make sense as a story, not just as a place. Like logically, sure, I can logically go to Africa, but which Africa? There's so many versions of Africa. We want an Africa that's going to tell us a story about a very particular thing. In fact, we want it to be a story about a challenge to the beauty and the wonder and the intrinsic value of the natural land of Africa. So that tells us if Africa, the Africa we're going out into, is supposed to be this beautiful natural place, to make that place appear more beautiful and natural, the village that you depart from should not be that. So where in Africa can we go to find inspiration from a style of architecture that is authentic, that is African, but does not mimic the feeling of nature that we want to have when we go out into nature? And so that led us to the Swahili architecture of the east coast of Africa that indeed became the inspiration for Rodhe. It is true that this is a real form of architecture that really exists along the east coast of Africa, but that's not why we chose it. We chose it because the geometry and the hardness and the whiteness and the cubic quality of that architecture sets it apart from this world of nature that we're going to go into, and will make that world appear more natural when we go out into it, because after all, it's not natural, it's a giant machine that we're building for keeping animals alive and moving thousands and thousands of people an hour in vehicles through, so it's got to feel like nature, not just look like nature, feel like nature, and part of the way we're going to do that is by managing the emotional sequence at the beginning. So if you feel the naturalness of that, then you're going to feel the threat all the more, which is, of course, a threat to harvest out the value of that nature, turn it from intrinsic value into monetary value. And therein lies the conflict that is at the source of almost every story at Animal Kingdom, the conflict between monetary, material value, and the intrinsic value of nature. Even Expedition Everest plays out this story through its plotline. So that makes it sound like, oh, we thought this up, and we followed the diagram, and we came up with this idea, and it all worked out very neatly. But of course, as I said before, that's never how it really happens. It's sort of like being blindfolded with a stick and sent off into the woods, and you sort of beat and whack your way through the woods until you get to the other side. So what follows, remember, we already know we've got this park about love of animals, intrinsic value of nature. We know that we want to bring people into this park in some way that is different than the way they've gotten into the other parks, which are about human stories and which are very architectural environments. And what follows is a series of renderings of various explorations of how we might do that. There was the art version, where we thought, well, you know, we're trying to save the planet, you know, like Noah, what if it was like an ark? We thought, you know what, we will never make it 2 steps down the racetrack with this idea before we're up to our hips in controversy. So, no. So then we thought of this idea, okay, it's like a garden architectural environment, and it's got sculptures of all these animals, and they're marching their way into the park like they've come to the park as if it was like an ark, and they're all marching in from everywhere, and we march in with these animals, and they're all around us, and they're all headed into the park. And then we thought, okay, so that means when I come to the park and I look at my first view and I take a photograph of my view, I'm looking at hundreds of animals' butts. Okay, so it's not that, that's not the idea. So we go to another idea. Okay, no, it's going to be like this kind of woodstocky, woodsy little village with stained glass and, you know, Art Nouveau little cottagey things in the woods, and, you know, and then we thought, okay, well, that's great if you're like a hippie. But that's not about animals. That's going all the way back to being about macrame and stained glass and granola, and that's not Animal Kingdom, so we didn't go